Welcome to Cryptic Accounts, a podcast by paranoid people for paranoid people. I'm your host for the week, Dennis Cheney, and this week on the show we have medieval UFOs and Faerie abductions. I'm joined as always by Patrick Ryan. How you doing, Patrick?
I'm good, Dennis. Ready to? I see you ran with the fairies. You've been really
Wanted
hoping,
to do this for a while.
and you were very upset a couple weeks ago when I didn't do it.
Oh no, it was dwarfs that I was upset
Oh,
about.
that's right. It was dwarfs. It was dwarfs that were missing.
Although it kind of seems like they're kind of the same thing.
Okay.
A little bit. Fairies aren't as small as I thought they would be, and dwarfs are, I don't know. It just depends on what you call people. Oh, and I did not mention for people to like, share, subscribe, do all that good stuff. Last month is our first show of May, but April was our best month ever. And yeah, we just really appreciative of everybody.
Yes, thank you all very much.
So this is kind of an accident of an episode. I got in a book a while back by Jacques Vallee, 1969, called Passport to Magonia, From Folklore to Flying Saucers. And really, most of this book is not about fairies. He goes into it enough that I was able to put together a show just from using this book and a little bit of outside research. But he really draws connections from all this folklore and medieval stuff to stuff from what was the modern day, I guess, in 1969.
Okay.
But for the most part, I left modern day stories out because a lot of them are stuff that we already know of, like Betty and Barney Hill, etc. And he was just making the broad case in this, basically, that there's more similarities than not between like folklore and UFO stuff. And I would encourage people to pick up the book. It's pretty cheap on Kindle, and there's just a lot of seriously, like the last 100 pages of the book is literally a catalog of like every UFO sighting from like 1868 to 1968.
Nice.
It's insane the amount of research that he did. Jacques Vallée is obviously a legend. And so he was writing this at kind of the height of the UFO contactee phenomenon.
Okay, so 60s, 70s.
Yeah, late 60s. It was 1969.
Okay.
So it's like kind of before the serious abduction stuff started happening.
This is just the fun time of abductions, just the lighthearted abducting.
Yeah, like I think Betty and Barney Hill are like the closest he gets to what we would call a UFO abduction.
Okay.
In like the modern way. But that actually it makes the book even better because at this time, like he doesn't mention the Greys, he doesn't mention like hybrid programs, but it makes some of the stuff he gets into, knowing what would come later in UFO research, like that much more interesting. Okay. Which is kind of how this show became about just the folklore side, because I ended up finding how that connects to stuff that we do on the show a lot more interesting than like some of the 1950s. You know, I was going along and I saw a crashed UFO and a man in a space helmet came out.
Yeah.
So in this book, Vallee decries that his contemporaries in the 60s were trying to put this phenomenon into a purely scientific box. And in his mission statement in the preface, he states that his goal of this book is to build a bridge between two clusters of rumors, the first being mythology and the second being modern UFOs. So historical material all set around one theme that he says is unique to every culture, pretty much only in the way that they choose to explain it. Vallee notes that the stories are the same, it's just the cultural overlay that's different, and that these beings seem to play off of that too. Today we see this as a scientific problem, but as Vallee states towards the end of the book, there's no such thing as a scientific problem. It is the man who looks at the problem, who is scientific in his approach or who is not. Science is an object in the mind of man, not a characteristic we are at liberty either to bestow upon or to withdraw from every funny-looking contraption that we happen to see in our skies.
Well, and we kind of got into that, just how the different cultures do that on the Atlantis episode that I put together. How different cultures, the Greeks and the Romans, some were more artistic in the way that they explain things with mythology, whereas others were more scientific.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a really good point. Yeah, it just seems to be whoever's looking at it. But then when you strip away the way they see other things, it all comes down to something very similar.
Yes.
So at the heart of this book is what he describes as visitation from an aerial people from one or more remote legendary countries, one of which is Magonia, heaven, hell, elfland, etc. And Magonia is basically the fairyland.
Okay. And we're going to get into what exactly that is and where it is, correct? Or should I ask my questions now?
Well, I get into it slightly, but the idea is that these are places that we're unable to reach unless they let us in.
Like, okay, so it's almost like another dimension, or back to rips in time and space or whatever, some weird little pocket that goes into another dimension almost.
Yeah, various times he says that, like, if you were to compare it to a scientific concept, it would be like a fourth dimension.
Okay.
But it does appear to be, there appear to be what he calls doorways that they can let you in and out of, but they kind of have to let you do it. So the name Magonia actually comes from a treatise from a French archbishop in the year 1815. And according to French mythology, it's the, quote, cloud realm from which felonious aerial sailors came. And basically it's the French folkloric idea that there are basically people piloting airships that would come down and like steal stuff. And
that seems that does kind of seem familiar to us a little bit.
yeah, it's interesting he chose that, but he also like refers to it synonymously with like elfland, basically, which is more of like a English idea.
So okay, so
yeah.
it's Elfland and Magonia. Those are two different places.
No,
They are the similar ideas.
They're realms. They're
Okay.
like the same. They're the same realm.
Okay.
Like I said, he even compares it to heaven and hell. And there's a lot of biblical stuff in this book I left out because it's almost its own topic, like Ezekiel and Enoch and stuff like that. But you know, like all researchers, he draws like every single connection he possibly can. But mainly, this is, and we'll get into the similarities of the ideas as we go. But Magnonia is like the French word for the sky realm, and like Elfland or Fairyland is like the kind of Scottish, Irish version of it. But either way, like the inhabitants are kind of the same.
Okay.
And kind of as we see, the idea of this book is that the whole spacecraft thing is kind of a cover for the fact that when you talk to these beings or when you really study them, just like people who study UFOs, you start to come to different conclusions than they come from somewhere else. They seem to come from here in some way.
Yeah.
And so he's one of the first people to get into this.
Okay.
So he begins his book with medieval UFO encounters. He begins in 1952 in the jungles of Mexico. And there, the scientists were busy exploring and mapping a lost Mayan city that has come to be known as the Palenque monuments, and in particular, a structure called the Pyramid of Inscriptions or the Temple of Inscriptions. And it's a famous pyramid in Mexico that was built by the Mayans. I included a picture here. It's just your classic step pyramid with like a temple on top.
Mm.
So we immediately start with pyramids. I can't get away from pyramids. So
everywhere.
They're everywhere. That's like the thing people do. I wonder why we don't build pyramids anymore. Like nobody builds pyramids anymore.
Yeah.
We just stopped at some point. So this is known today as the Temple of Inscriptions. It's in the state of Chiapas in Mexico. I think I might have actually visited this when I was in high school on a cruise, and we went and saw pyramids. But I don't remember where we were. So this temple was constructed in the 7th century, and it's been instrumental in our understanding of the Mayans and their religion because it houses among it some of the most hieroglyphs and tablets of anything we can find from the Mayans.
Okay.
And at this time, the late 7th century, this is considered like the height of the Mayan civilization because they basically mysteriously collapsed in the 9th century.
Okay.
So this is one of the last great structures they built. So in June of 1952, archaeologists were studying this, and they discovered there was actually a secret passage of stairs that led down from near the top of the monument down into an underground structure level. And in this underground level, they find that this temple was meant to be dedicated to an entity called Kukulkan. And I don't think you'll be too surprised as to how this god is described. He is their serpent god, or
Hmm.
their feathered serpent god. So, flying reptile guy. He's variously known as the winged serpent, feather serpent, or vision serpent.
He's their dinosaur god.
He's their dinosaur god. He's basically, I don't know, I feel like we run into serpent entities a lot when we're talking about like space travel and stuff like that.
Yeah, it does
So
come up sometimes. Yeah.
it does. So he is their serpent being who comes from the sky. He was known as a liaison, basically between the kings and the entities of heaven. He's sometimes identified as a tall white person, and other times as this lizard being. And
Hmm.
he's the same entity that the Aztecs knew as Quetzalcoatl, which is the god that like some of their priests thought they mistook the Spanish people for because of
Hmm.
their large ships. So in this underground temple is a very interesting depiction of this flying serpent god, and I've included it for you here. And
It's like he's riding a weird crotch rocket.
yeah,
Like
it's like
he's positioned like a motorcycle almost.
yeah, he seems to be. It's a very large, and he's drawn like an Aztec man, but he seems to be strapped into some sort of vehicle
It's
that is like,
some sort of machinery. It
yeah,
doesn't look comfortable at all.
no, but it does look like he's piloting like a space motorcycle or something like that.
Yeah.
And if you notice on the back of the machine, there appears to be like fire coming out.
There's something coming out, yeah. Kind of all around the back quarter of it.
Right. So I just think
What
it's
smoke or
interesting.
I don't know. It
Yeah, there seems to be smoke coming off the sides and some sort of like flame or light coming out the back. Uh,
yeah.
and it appears to be some sort of complex machinery, which is interesting when you consider this is what they thought their winged serpent looked like. Basically,
Yeah.
a big guy flying a rocket.
Yeah, I mean it's just it's trying to put yourself in the mind space of like, okay, I have no concept of vehicles at all. Like motorcycles don't exist. A horse is the closest thing I can think of that I ride like that, where I'm straddling something.
Yeah.
He's almost looks like he's like kneeled down this thing. It doesn't look like he's straddling it per se, because it doesn't look like he's really sitting on anything. It looks like his knees are kind of at the front of it there, and his feet are just kind of. I don't know. It again, it does not look comfortable at all.
No. Um, but I
My
mean, I
shins
think,
hurt a little bit right now just from looking at it.
and it depends. I mean, it's like a 2D drawing, so he could be sitting on that thing that his butt's touching. This could just be the way they draw it.
Wait,
But
all
yeah,
right. So he's like angled up in reality, is what's happening.
I don't know, and I don't know if anyone knows what all this stuff he's like engineering with is. I don't
It
know if
is a
anyone.
very busy picture. There's a
It
lot
is a
going
very
on
big,
here.
but he seems locked into whatever this machine is. Now, this was interesting. I didn't know this, but this is like especially complex and weird for historians because apparently, and I never knew this till I read this book. The Mayans, despite their pyramids and stuff, were actually not very technologically advanced, and we believe that they, in fact, did not even invent the wheel.
Hmm. Okay.
So that makes this an even more like, what the heck is this guy doing? Like,
Yeah.
you can't even say it's like a chariot because they didn't have chariots. Um,
Again,
they
back
had
to the how do you come up with this if you have no similar concept whatsoever? You had to have seen something that looked kind of like this. It's a
it's
very weird place for an imagination to go, even with abstract art and everything. Just again, back to trying to put yourself in that time in history and the amount of technology that was around them.
it's truly bizarre.
It's very weird.
So
So detailed.
I
So
know,
detailed. Like,
and
what's
that's
going on with all the patterns? I'm assuming with hieroglyphs, all this stuff around the outside says something. Like, it has some meaning.
yeah, I
Each one of
assume so
those
too.
rectangles is different.
I know, and at
They
various
don't
times,
repeat. Oh, no, that one repeats. A couple of them do repeat. For the most part, they're very original, though. The sides
Yeah,
are longer. The pieces seem to be longer there in that section. I would almost think that that's I don't know. I'm not even gonna venture a guess at what Mayan hieroglyphs mean because there's
I don't know.
far more educated people about this that I'm just that's got to mean something now.
Right, and I don't know. I tried to look into this piece of art. Of course, in his book, he doesn't have any images. It's a very old book, so I had to go and be like, "What's he talking about again?" And this is the one that matched the description perfectly.
Okay.
But I was unable to figure out what all these hieroglyphs actually mean.
Okay, so nobody's maybe figured it out then.
Possibly.
Well,
I know that we do not know a lot about the Mayans, and what we probably know more about the Aztecs than we do the Mayans because they actually existed when Europeans came here and they got wiped out pretty fast. So.
yeah.
So I just thought that was interesting. A culture that's never invented the wheel through such a complex machine, and that the person they call the sky serpent appears to be operating some sort of machine.
Yeah.
So the next thing I found interesting was Vallee starts going into ancient Japanese records, and he gets way more into these than I'm about ready to go into. But Japan, I guess they're a very old civilization that still exists, so they have very good medieval records of UFOs.
Really?
Down to the date. And some of these I'll say the precise date, and some of these I'll just say the month and the year, and some of these I'll just say the year. But in the book, each one of these is documented to the day. It doesn't just say around the 1100s. It says like on October 27th, 1110. Like because these records are so well kept back into the Middle Ages.
Interesting. Okay.
And I've never thought about, or very rarely have thought about Japanese UFOs. But if you think
Yeah,
about
I
it,
mean, I think I've only kind of touched on Asian records like that a couple times in different episodes, and yeah, it's surprising that we need to probably look into more stuff that they have records on like this. I didn't think
in
about that. Yeah,
China
they were
too.
they would have been very organized even a couple thousand years ago as far as record keeping and all that because they were a
Yeah,
well established society at that point.
Japan and China, I think we've really underserved.
Yeah, because I'm sure they go back way into the BCs that have accurate records kept on a
Mm-hmm.
lot of stuff.
Yeah, back to
Interesting.
Roman times at least.
Yeah.
So one such record is from October 27th, 1180, and this
It's a
is a
good
record
year.
of good year, good year. This record is a report that a luminous object shaped like an earthenware vessel, which is a bowl, flew from a mountain in the Kii province to the northern mountains of Fukuhira in the dead of night and was seen by many people.
Always with the mountains.
That's the thing. And we're going to keep talking about that because the Japanese seem to have known that even though they see these things in the sky, that they come from the sea and the mountains.
I think I'm gonna
So
start going to more mountains and caves and stuff.
I think honestly, if we do go UFO hunting, like we need to go around some of these like sacred mountains and stuff like that to find these
Agreed.
things. Now, this record from 1180 is noteworthy because the description of an earthenware vessel is pretty much technically the first time in history that somebody called something a saucer.
Wow.
Is that would be the same shape.
Yeah.
So in September of 1235, Japanese records report that General Yoritsumi was camping with his army when a mysterious source of light was seen swinging in circles in the southwest sky all night. The general then ordered what is the first recorded military investigation of UFOs in history. Vallee finds humor in this account because the report, which the general put all of his best men and scholars into, is remarkably similar in its ridiculousness to the UFO's early military reports. So the general saw these.
You mean the U.S.?
Yeah, to the U.S. Yeah, sorry, to the U.S.'s military reports. So the general saw these dancing lights in the sky. He sent his best scholars to go research it and investigate why, and they came to the conclusion that, quote, this phenomenon is completely natural, and their explanation was that it must have been the wind blowing the stars.
Oh, okay.
This is like the first. So they have the first example in history where they call something a saucer, and then they have the first example where the military comes in and says,
Covers it
"No,
up.
no, it's not." Yeah. And
Good
medieval
stuff.
Japan, they're replete with these things. And oftentimes these UFOs would come during war or times of social unrest.
That's a very recurring theme and everything.
It is, and he lists. This book sometimes goes into just list of things, but I had 3 that I found interesting. In 1271, a UFO interrupted the beheading of a famous priest who ended up getting let off because they considered it a sign.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting. That's okay. I don't even know what to take away from that. I would need to know more about that priest.
Yeah, and he doesn't go into it too much.
Okay.
In 1361, a flying object that was shaped like a, quote, drum emerged from the inland sea in western Japan.
Water, ocean. Okay.
And there was a big flap of sightings in 1458 that seemed to coincide with riots during a big time of unrest. And these things are kind of similar. Like UFOs tend to show up in wartime a lot.
Yeah.
They tend to show up to troops. And I have here a picture, which is somewhat unrelated. This wasn't mentioned in the book, but I kind of started doing a little research on my own of Japanese UFO legends. And this is a real scroll from 19th century Japan. And it shows what's called the Utsurabun object, which is basically a legend of a UFO washing up on a beach.
Okay.
And that's the way they describe the craft is kind of drawn there. So those are some interesting little things that from the Mexican American culture, Japanese culture.
Yeah, that UFO looks like a top, kind of like a really fat top.
Yeah, and when you read into that one a bit, people have questioned whether or not it's even meant to be a UFO or whether it's meant to be some kind of water vessel. But nowadays, when we talk so much about them coming in and out of the ocean and perhaps bases being in the ocean, I kind of look back at this and say, well, maybe the reason scholars question the UFO thing is because the ocean thing, but now we're finding there's connections between them and the ocean. Yeah. So what's the difference between finding one on the ground in Roswell versus washing up on the beach in Japan?
Yeah.
So at this point, Vallee jumps to medieval Europe, and his first story is from Tübingen, Germany in 1577. In the early morning hours of 1577, I think it was actually like 6 or 7 a.m., the town became filled with dark clouds in the sky, and out of it came flashing lights and suddenly objects resembling large, tall hats, according to the villagers.
Weird.
Yeah. And if you think about what a hat looks like, they're either triangles or a hat.
Yeah.
So saucer shaped or triangle shaped. Came down from the sky and started flashing red, green, and yellow, and suddenly started filling up the sky with numerous of these. It basically had a battle. And this was one of a couple medieval sky battles. And I've included a picture here that was drawn of the incident. You can't make heads or tails.
No, I don't. I mean, the sun's there. He looks like he may have chicken pox.
He looks very upset.
There's weird, I don't know, little crosses. It's very weird shapes. There's poles, it looks like. I don't know. Yeah,
which might be cigar-shaped craft.
Yeah, it's just, I mean, if this is that, I'm just trying to decide if this is like an artistic take on it, or if this is like them kind of doing their best to like kind of show what it looked like a little. Obviously, the sun has a face, which that's artistic. That's what I'm kind of like, is this, I don't know.
I think around this time, that's how people drew.
That's what drew. Yeah, a lot of like, the sun and the moon always got faces for some reason.
I know. Isn't it weird how little kids always draw the sun with faces too?
Yeah.
I don't know why we want to make the sun a guy.
I don't know.
But again, it's a medieval drawing, so.
But still, not that long ago, and they're talking about.
Yeah, it's more the description. Yeah, it's more the description of the way the crafts look and what they did, not so much how well they were drawn. But
yeah,
I guess the fact that they put time and energy into this shows that it happened. So the church at the time saw it as a sign that people need to repent. There was more than one of these battles. So
Did
this
they
next
repent?
part. I don't know. I'm guessing not. Um, this next part gets a little weird, and I had a lot of stories to choose from, but I wanted a story that transitions us just from people seeing UFOs to people meeting weird entities that are like Earth entities.
Okay.
So this is another church story. It's the story of Saint Anthony, who lived around 300 AD. And there's a
Okay.
famous legend of him, and he's believed to have met a being of, quote, small stature while he was alone in the desert. So he's out in the desert, he's living his monastic lifestyle, and then he came across this tiny being that's kind of described as a satyr who tries to tempt him to eat fruit from this palm tree that appears.
Okay.
And they have a conversation, and when he asks him who the being is, he explicitly denies being like anything spiritual. He says, I'm a mortal being sent to represent my tribe. And he identified himself to the saint as the same creature that the Gentiles think of as satyrs or incubus or fauns.
Okay.
And so I have a picture here, a painting of this encounter.
It's like a centaur.
Yeah, it's a satyr.
Okay.
With
Is
just
that
like
is
a
that a
little.
different word for centaur?
No, a centaur is like a human body on a horse's, like a human top on a horse's bottom. A
Okay.
satyr usually is like half goat and
Okay.
has
And
like
I was gonna
horns
say
of.
he does have like some sort of horns, or after last week's episode, I would say antennas immediately. Like that's the first thing that comes to mind is
Oh yeah,
this like
ant
a weird
people.
ant guy blend.
So this kind of needs some explanation because
Oh
so
yeah,
there
it
are
definitely needs some explanation.
it's not like why this guy from Egypt is seeing a satyr. And the way the significance that Vallee puts into it, and I did a little research myself to make sure this fit. So satyrs are like basically these like mischievous forest beings
Hmm.
in Europe, and they're somewhat involved in like fairy legend. Um, they kind of predate the fairy stuff though. They're more of like the very early like mythical creatures that are kind of fairy stuff, kind of like Dionysus and stuff like that.
Hmm.
And the important thing about this is one of the first encounters where the person who encountered them didn't see them as spiritual. He saw them as a natural phenomenon and co-inhabiting the earth with us.
Okay.
And that this is like not a question of angels or demons. It's some kind of trickster type spirit or entity that shares the earth with us.
Okay.
So Vallee then goes into multiple UFO flaps in the Middle Ages Europe, where sky people were seen descending from craft, and also legends where these crafts would carry away villagers and mess with people's crops.
Abductions and crop circles.
Yeah.
But if you were in the medieval times, you probably wouldn't, unless you were up on a hill or happened to be able to see a field from a hill or a mountain, you wouldn't really know that's what it was. It was just like somebody messed up your field in weird ways.
So at this time, interestingly, the people referred to them as sorcerers.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and they would often think that they were sorcerers from like another country coming to like wage like asymmetrical magical warfare on them, basically.
All right.
Yeah.
It's an explanation, I guess. Not a great one, but it's an explanation.
No, but it's also similar to how we think UFOs might be like Russian or Chinese, you know what I mean? Or Mars.
Yeah. All right.
It's
Well,
like
when you frame it like that, now I feel like I'm from the Middle Ages or whatever.
the
So,
theme of this is he keeps going back to, and I didn't want to write it down the way he says it over and over again, but he keeps going back to the idea that historically we've always seen this phenomenon not as necessarily from space or heaven. We just as frequently seen it as coming from like a secret other country
yeah.
that's inhabited by these other inhabitants of Earth. Um, So they would sometimes carry away villagers, mess with crops, and some emperors, like around Charlemagne's time, actually had legal prescriptions for what to do if you could catch one. Like a couple of them had like the death penalty like written into the law if you could catch like one of these aliens.
Like they would give it the death penalty.
Yeah, like kill these things if you can find them.
Oh, it was like a contract basically. Like it's cool. It's not murder if it's one of these things.
Right.
Sort of thing.
It's like a law. It's like anyone who finds one of these things gets to kill them.
Okay.
So in 1500s in Lyons, France, I found this story very interesting. 3 aerial ships descended outside of the town, and the entire city came to greet them. Out of the ships came 3 men and 1 woman who were not looking so great.
Okay.
So the townspeople immediately accused these people of being sorcerers or invaders and wanted to burn them per the law.
Well, I mean, that was kind of the reaction of the day is magic and burn things.
Yeah, if it's magic, burn it.
Or if it's not magic, probably burn it. There's only one way to be safe, and that's to burn it.
Oh, yeah. Just if you don't understand it, you got to burn it.
Yep.
So I found this story interesting because it goes very quickly from what you might consider a UFO encounter to what you could consider an abduction encounter.
Okay.
Because as the ships flew away and left these 3 people, and he makes very clear these people are people. They look like people.
Okay.
They do not look like aliens. The 3 men and the 1 woman started pleading with the townspeople and trying to like explain that not to burn them. And their explanation was that they were from a different country, another part of the country, and that they were field workers, and that all 3 had been abducted by the inhabitants of the craft. So they were all out working on a farm. They got abducted, and then they got dropped off in the wrong country, basically. And they're like, we got nothing to do with these crafts. We're just taken by them.
Okay.
So the church leaders eventually convinced the mob that these were, in fact, human beings, but also did not believe the people's story about being taken aboard the craft.
It's a weird middle ground.
Yeah, they basically said, you're all crazy. They kept every part of the story except for the craft. And
well, that's kind of weird because it's like, again, the whole town showed up and saw them. So they were in the craft. They are humans. Yeah. The craft isn't there anymore. So they obviously don't really have control of the craft. Okay. Well, at least they didn't get burnt. That's good, I guess.
Anyway, they said
they accepted them and loved them, and they lived in the town forever, I'm assuming.
No, they just let them go. They're like, go back to where you came from.
So they died in the forest somewhere trying to find home.
Probably. They're probably like, where are we again?
Probably got picked up by the aliens again.
Oh, yeah, definitely. But that reminds me, there's lots of alien abduction stories where people get picked up out in the woods or whatever, and they end up like in a town naked, or they end up like on a roof somewhere.
I would be pissed if, like, you take me home.
Oh, yeah.
Just take me back where you got me.
The aliens are like sloppy with where they drop people off a lot of times.
Well, they don't care. I mean,
or the aliens, I guess.
Have you ever moved a spider out of your house?
Do you think that's a good point? No, nope. That's a good point.
Didn't care at all. You're alive. Be happy I didn't kill you.
That's probably true.
Oh man, that is probably basically the attitude.
Another historical story I found interesting just because of who it was is Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who's a famous German statesman, author, and scientist. He describes that when he was a young man in 1768, he was traveling with 2 companions to the University of Leipzig in Germany from Frankfurt. And suddenly the 3 people saw a luminous object at ground level. I believe it was hovering like 3 feet off the ground. And it spit out, it was like a mother craft of some sort that spit out other crafts that flew around. And he wrote about this in his biography. And he's not the type of person you would expect to put that in his biography.
Yeah.
All right. Now, at this point, he starts getting heavy into the Faerie people.
Which is why we're all here.
This is why we're all here. He gets into the Scottish and Irish myths of creatures known as the good people or the gentry, or as we know them, the fairies. These are a race of people who they believe live in the sea and inside of mountains. They're identified. Yeah.
Big, just recurring theme, just at this point. Just like, I don't even know that we need to say it anymore. Like, you could just leave those blank, and I think you could just fill in mountains and sea every time.
That's where UFOs come from. They're identified with fairy folklore, and they would often appear to be about 3 or 4 feet tall in most of these encounters that I was reading. I always thought of fairies as like really tiny people, but
Well, I think Disney did that to us.
yeah, Disney and fairy tales. Um,
Yeah.
so other similarities include missing time. For instance, the story of a Scottish farmer who disappeared for 3 weeks searching for missing cattle, and when he returned, he believed he'd only been gone for 3 hours.
Ooh, that's going to be a heated argument with the wife.
That's exactly what happened. So he was at an
Oh,
argument with his
really?
wife. Yeah. So he had an argument with his wife. He was like, "Where in the world have you been?" He went out looking for cows. It's been 3 weeks. He states that he basically was like, "You're crazy. It's only been a few hours." He said he went out and he was trekking near the mountains when suddenly he looked around him and he realized he was surrounded by little men who were like had encircled him and basically like corralled him like an animal. They offered him this small cake to eat, and that's like the last thing he remembers.
They like roofied him with cake?
It's fairies are roofing everyone, man. They give you something to drink. They give you cake. It's bizarre.
Okay. Well, they're little. I mean, I guess it evens things out. I don't know. You're right though. That does come up a lot. They do seem to use elixirs a lot. The cake's a new thing for me. I was not aware of that. I heard more about liquids, I guess.
And kind of the rule in like fairy stories is like don't eat their food or you'll be trapped.
In Fairyland?
Yep.
Well, I'd have
But
to
if
see
you
what Fairyland's like before I make any decisions like that. Also, what does the food look like? What does it smell? There's a lot to process there.
have you ever seen Pan's Labyrinth?
Yeah.
Do you remember that scene where she goes into she draws the doorway with the chalk and she goes into the room? Yeah. Everyone should check out Pan's Labyrinth.
Yeah.
So I just find this story. The next one's like maybe the only modern story I get into, and I think it's funny because it's like a modern story of a man being given cake by aliens. And I'm not sure if we've ever discussed this, but this is the story of Joe Simonton, who was a Wisconsin chicken farmer. And in 1961, he claimed to have been visited by a flying craft, and the three men got out and gave him pancakes in exchange for water from his well.
Okay.
And Vallee gets way into this pancake water thing. Like, there's some fairy folklore where they're always after fresh water, and they'll give us like cakes in exchange for the. I don't know. It's just the whole thing. So, and this is. I have a picture here of the man with one of the pancakes.
It looks burnt.
Yeah, it's a bizarre looking cake.
It's not even a well cooked pancake. It's like he. That's a disappointing pancake. I'm gonna be honest with you.
And he said it tasted weird. He went ahead and ate it.
Well, then he passed out and woke up 3 weeks later.
I think the weirdest thing about the story is that the U.S. military actually took his story seriously.
Okay.
They took it seriously enough to scientifically test his pancakes.
And what did they come up with?
It was made out of flour, water, and grease.
So it's pancakes.
It's a pancake. So he was just given a straight up poorly cooked pancake by aliens. But I just find it really weird that they would test his pancakes.
Well,
like what's going on that they know about where they're like, we better test this guy's pancakes?
Obviously, there's been some record of something with some other little fairy beings or something that they're aware of and have heard about people getting knocked out and stuff, and they want to see if this is a roofie pancake.
I mean, that's. I would suspect if you're working for the Pentagon, somebody gives you a pancake, you're gonna be like, "Get away from me!" Like, what are you talking about?
I don't know, man. It's the '60s, right?
That's true. It was 61.
They're like they've been staring at goats, eating acid. Like, I don't know. They're pretty out there at this point.
They're like, "All right, bring the fairy pancake. Let's eat it."
That's what I mean. Like, I think they probably ran. I think there's you were onto it. Is like it's because they have some experience with these things and they're grabbing at any bit of little evidence they can have to figure out what they are, what's going on.
Yeah, you got to be desperate for information when you're testing pancakes. So he then gets into more obvious similarities between UFOs and folklore. He talks about how this phenomenon happens in nearly all nations, how the fairies possess a magical ability to travel across continents almost instantaneously, and how there's similarities between crop circles or what are known as fairy rings before modern times.
Interesting.
And so I put two pictures here. One is semi-related. It's what's known as the Hertfordshire mowing devil, which is this like old drawing of a demon figure making a crop circle.
And it was like actually just a crop. It started out very basic. Apparently, it was just like a circle.
There's a circle, and then I have an old-timey drawing of what they envision fairy circles to be, which is basically the fairies dancing around until they make the circles.
Yeah. All right.
And really,
I like how they called it the mowing devil.
mm-hmm.
Like that's pretty great.
If you look into early crop circles too, like the first pictures, they are simple.
How has no lawnmower company not ever used the mowing devil as like a brand or a model with that little guy on there?
That's such a good idea. I don't know. Maybe just people don't like to buy things associated with the devil.
I beg to differ. Dodge has a whole line of vehicles called Hellcat and stuff.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh man, we need to make the mowing. We need to license this. So
yeah, we call dibs on that. Don't anybody screw us over on that.
We are going to copyright the mowing devil.
Now he's got to come up with an idea for a lawnmower to use this name. We've got the important part, which is the name, though. I think that's the most important part. We can build everything else around it.
I would be shocked if somebody hasn't at some point.
I'm sure it has been used for something.
We're always coming up with business ideas in the middle of shows.
Yep.
So at this point, Vallee is just like laying on one story on top of another. It is hard to describe. Who did Genesis Revisited, our series on that? Was that
Sitchin?
Sitchin, that's right. This guy is this guy maybe is only rivaled by Sitchin with the amount of stuff he can just layer on. Like I tried to cut out everything that wasn't like medieval based.
Yeah.
But he just starts laying on all these similarities from all across the world. And his big point is that the transition between the fairy stories and the UFO is more seamless than we give it credit for. So most people don't realize that these medieval sky wars and fairy stories go up into the 18th century, which is like right before we start getting stories of airships, which is right before we start getting stories of UFOs. They're like, there's this famous meme that's like miracle and UFO sightings, and it's like before cameras were invented, there's a lot of them, and then it's like none of them, then it's like after Photoshop was invented, and it's like way up. But like his point is like there is no gap. It's not like we used to believe this and then we got scientific, now we have UFOs. Like that gap that we see in the middle just never really happened. Like it was fairies like right up to the point in the 1800s when it was sky ships, and he just beats you over the head with that information. So he then goes into what I found to be super interesting, which is what might be considered the first treatise on UFOs. And that was written in the last half of the 17th century by Scottish scholar, the Reverend Kirk of Aberfoyle, who is really is really credited with cataloging and like studying these elf and fairy stories.
Okay.
He wrote a manuscript that's known as The Secret Commonwealth. And he notes that in this extensive study, Reverend Kirk unveiled the following things. One, that the nature of these beings is somewhere between man and angels. Two, that they have light or fluid bodies similar to that of a mist or a cloud and are able to disappear at will. I want to point out that this lighter fluid body thing is very similar to what they say about certain Venetians and like contactee aliens.
Mm-hmm.
That they somehow exist as like a mist, but they can appear solid.
Yeah.
3, they're incredibly intellectual beings. 4, they can carry away anything or anyone that they like. 5, they live inside the earth. 6, they predated man as living on the earth. 7, he noticed that they often appear to people while traveling, especially on highways. And 8, when they speak to people about their own beliefs, their core ideas seem to be that nothing dies and everything is cyclical. Which, I don't know. I found some interest. I don't know. When you think about different contactee stuff, like it seems to be similar. Yeah. Like a lot of reincarnation speak, and like we're going to put your soul in this, and we're going to take that, and also visiting people on highways. That seems to be something that still happens.
Yeah.
And this was like literally, I think, 1660 or something when he was writing this. So Kirk, like previous scholars, notes that he believed that we can create pacts or treaties with these creatures, but that nothing good can come from these treaties. Kirk concludes that he believes there's a coming age in our relationships between us and the aerial beings where we'll grow and become more accustomed to them, and that our interactions with them will become as commonplace as other technology.
Seems like he's talking about what it feels like we're kind of getting to right now with all the disclosure and everything that's going on.
Right. And it's hard to get into everything Reverend Kirk wrote, but it's important to realize that this is one of the first, I would call it, systematic studies. He really sat down and took like he really did what like modern UFO writers did. He took like every Faerie account and he's like, let's strip this down to like, it's our most basic, what can we learn about these things?
Yeah.
And it just lines up really well with UFOs. So Vallee then goes on to expound on how UFOs are also inherently apparitions that match these earlier descriptions, but the scientific-minded researchers of the 20th century sweep many of the more bizarre stories under the rug for fear of ridicule. And he goes on to mention numerous acquaintances of his and researchers who admit that in their studies they hear these more fantastic folkloric type stories, but also admit that they can never publish that data because they would be run out of the field of ufology.
Interesting. I mean, it makes sense, but it's also, as people doing what we're doing, that really kind of stinks that stuff's suppressed heavily.
The stigma's going away, though.
Well, yeah, now that we're getting disclosure about like, oh yeah, there are UFOs, stuff's crashing, we don't know what it is. There's things that fly around past us, we don't know what they are. We're your government, we have no idea what's going on.
Yeah, and I think his main point though is like, remember, this is around the time of like Project Blue Book and stuff like that. Like, he's already talking to people who believe in UFOs.
Yeah.
And they're saying these are aliens from another planet. So these are people who are already believe.
Yeah.
And he's saying that when they go out to interview experiencers, they'll have stuff like they gave me a cake, or they appeared ethereal. And the researchers would oftentimes just leave those details out of their stuff because it's okay to talk about aliens, kind of, but it's not okay to talk about like spirit, weird, fairy things from mountains. And that's just kind of his point that he keeps driving home, is that this stuff has not changed. You just don't read about it the same for numerous reasons. One, our culture is different. Two, we'll be more made fun of. But three, it just has not changed. So I'm going to end this on, and we still got a ways to go, but I'm going to end this on what I call part 3 of my research of this book, which is stories of Faerie abductions.
Okay.
Which are a lot more interesting than just they gave me a cake and we played the flute, which is normally what we hear.
Yeah.
So in his treatise, Reverend Kirk goes into a deep dive into stories of what were known at the time as Faerie kidnappings, or what we would call abductions today. And like UFO researchers who end up in the middle of phenomenon themselves, it's actually commonly believed that Kirk might have been abducted himself. Kirk is supposedly buried in the churchyard of the abbey where he lived, but legend has it that there's nothing in his coffin but rocks. When later researchers interviewed his successor, Reverend Taylor said that there's actually not an official record of how Kirk died. And it's believed by the townfolk that he disappeared near a fairy knoll and was taken because the fairies were upset that he was exposing their secrets. And it's also rumored that to prove this, he was allowed to visit a family member after he supposedly died. But it is important.
So they let him show up once to like tell a family member, like, I got taken. Tell everyone. Bye.
I'm not really dead.
Interesting. All right. And then the fairies like unzip a little hole and grab him, pull him back there or something.
That's kind of what it sounds like.
Ugh.
So
I don't know that we should be poking at the fairies this much.
Oh, I don't know. I'm a little.
I don't know. I haven't heard that much about Fairyland. It might be awesome there.
It doesn't sound that awesome.
Well,
it sounds like it's interesting for a while, but you kind of want to go home. So regarding this thing about Kirk himself being abducted, regardless of whether or not that's a legend, Kirk's work about the Faerie kidnappings does go into a pattern of detail of the Faerie abductions. This includes conditions and purposes of the abduction, the cases of relief from Elfland, as he calls it, and what Vallee calls the, quote, relativistic aspect of the encounters. And then by relativistic, he just means like time dilations.
Okay.
So as part of the treatise, Kirk goes into a number of stories, one of which I found interesting is a legal document from the country of Sweden in 1660, sworn to by a husband of a midwife, which recounts a story of his wife being taken to fairyland to assist a troll's wife in giving birth to a child.
What?
So the husband who drafted this document and notarized it basically was a clergyman named Peter Rom. He states that one evening he and his wife were at their farmhouse when a short man dressed in all gray appeared at their door and began begging his wife to assist his wife in labor. And there are numerous other encounters of women being approached by these beings and taken to Magonia or Elfland, a place that seems to be in between dimensions. And in all of these tales, women are tasked with helping these other beings give birth and sometimes breastfeeding the infants. These stories all also oddly occur in Chinese folklore.
I don't know why. This is one of the weirdest parts of this whole thing. Like, why do they need human women to help them give birth? Like, what have they been doing this whole time? Have they always needed people to do this for them?
Either that, or this is just part of the hybrid program.
Some weird mind game.
Right, and he knows that like basically everything that we call fairy tales today are like sanitized versions of these original tales. A lot of times they'll just be identical stories, but they'll take out the part about giving birth or breastfeeding a fairy child or whatever. So in these accounts where people are taken against their will, the fairies seem to target young women, especially pregnant women and young mothers. Oftentimes the fairies will swap out the children with children of their own, which is where the folklore of changelings came from. There appears, Vallee says, to be a genetic motive for these abductions, similar to more contemporary tales of aliens. And it's worth noting, as I stated earlier, that Vallee's writing this book before we really had any knowledge of the hybrid program or any of that in consciousness. These stories stretch from Ireland to Sweden and imply that the motive was, quote, preserving and improving their race. On one hand, the stories center around carrying off human children to be raised by the elves and to become united with their race. And on the other hand, taking in women for milk and foster care. And Vallee goes into other interesting parallels. So, for instance, let's go back to Mezo-America and Aztec stories of Quetzalcoatl. And Quetzalcoatl, as I stated earlier, was the Aztec version of the serpent god, Kulkan. So many people know the basics of the sky serpent god, but they don't speak much about the mythologies surrounding his little minions, which are known as Aikau. These are little miniature black beings who were often seen flying through the air on what looked like jetpacks, and who were known to steal women. The legends state that the women they abducted were taken to caves and would be forced to have children at an unnatural rate, sometimes at one child a month or even once a week.
Oh.
So in some way they were using these women as breeding stock, and it obviously you can't give birth to a kid in a week or a month, but you know what you can do is you can artificially inseminate someone and take the kid and grow it in a test tube or whatever.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I guess you're not necessarily saying that whatever that was that they had created had come to full term. It could have been, you're right, transferred once that, I don't know. Yeah, okay.
So the children these women would have would sometimes be halfway in between human, or they would be straight up these small black beings. And then these women would oftentimes watch these children be taught how to operate the flying devices.
Horrifying. Absolutely horrifying.
So interestingly, a researcher named Brian Strauss was informed by his research subjects, who were some surviving inhabitants of these Native American groups, that a number of these recorded cases of abductions and impregnancies were happening well into the 20th century, with 1947, the year of Roswell, being a big year.
Okay.
And as Vallee notes, a survey of the literature of these Faerie abductions and impregnancies go well into the 1800s. And what we call fairy tales are often always these stories only cleansed of their sexual connotation. And it's like we're some kind of like traumatized race that has this happen to us over and over again. And we want to pass down the stories, but we can't bring ourselves to basically pass down the whole truth because it's terrifying.
Cool.
So, UFOs taking pregnant women, impregnating them, making us raise their kids, making hybrids, all the way back to the Middle Ages.
I mean, there's nothing new under the sun, I guess. Like, all has been happening the whole time. Weird.
Yeah, there's a lot of, and that's basically exhausted all of the Middle Ages stuff he had in his book. There's so many contemporary stories too, but I don't know. I want to get more into this. I just don't know how much there is, how much more there is about this hybrid stuff, maybe going back into the Middle Ages, but this has lit something in me that I want to look into. I still want to finish into the Fringe, and that obviously gets into some hybrid stuff, but I don't know. That's what I got for you this week.
It was very good. It was interesting. A lot more to fairies than I would have thought there were, because this is definitely not a subject I've looked real far into. But man, you were right. A lot of just crossover here, and it is very depressing that this appears to have all been happening since humans have been on the face of the earth.
I think it's weird is like you think of the hybrid program as like, oh, there'll come a day when they replace us with hybrids, but if this has been happening for 1,000 years, then like, is there really an end game, or do they just, like you said, do they just do this? Like, do they just need us, or I don't know.
Well, apparently sometimes some of them need us to give them water for cakes, which is weird, and help us like give birth to their children. It's obviously some sort of, they need us for something, or are using us for something. And as we've kind of talked about already with the End of the Fringe Part 2, like, I think that was the one where this whole abduction treaty or whatever, and they already may just be doing what they need us for already with this genetic stuff. And there's not going to be any weird invasion because it's already happened, and they're doing what they're doing.
Yeah, it's like long over. Yeah, whatever they need, they're getting.
Yeah, it definitely seems like they're getting it. If what we've heard about the hybrid stuff and everything, who knows? Maybe they use us to create some intermediary race that they're then sending to other galaxies or whatever to inhabit different places as drones.
Not think about that.
Because we have this resilient genetic thing to us. We somehow rose to, an apex predator level when looking at things that would have been around thousands of years ago or whatever, millions of years ago, whatever you want to say. We shouldn't have been the thing that survived. We should have been eaten many times over by so many different things, just constantly, just getting eaten all the time.
But we're half Anunnaki.
See, and then you get into that, like,
who knows?
And if they made us, then why are these other experiments going on? Like, why are they still? I don't know.
Yeah, it seems to be never ending. I kind of want to get into the similarities eventually too with Quetzalcoatl and Enki.
Yeah.
There's just everything ties back into itself. It's so weird. It's so weird that this could be going on for so long and we still have no idea.
Nope. It seems like we get different little pockets of us get little insights into what's happening, but we don't talk about it enough as a species to really connect it all, to be able to form a network, to be able to have some sort of defense against this. Because 90% of us are going to think it's not real at any given time, which is probably the biggest move of all of it, is making sure that we think that the people that are having this happen to them are crazy by not letting most of the people see it.
And this has to be why they're so capricious, though, is to make most of us think we're crazy.
Mm-hmm.
They tend to do stuff sometimes that just is for no other reason than to make people not believe you.
Yeah, sometimes it seems like that. It's just sometimes it seems like they do weird stuff just so there's no pattern.
Yeah. there can be no pattern. Yeah. But then we do find patterns, and that's what we write about. But then it's like those things are, there's a circle in a field. It's like, oddly enough, there are African crop circles.
Really?
Yeah, I didn't include that because it wasn't part of the book. But when I was getting into Mowing Devil, eventually I might have to do. We really are ignoring the rest of the world. We need an Asian episode. We need like an Aboriginal episode. We need like a. We pretty much have stuck to the Americas and Europe, but this really opened me up to these little hints about other
I
things.
did some stuff with Shangri-La and all that.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I want to get into China and Japan eventually.
Yeah.
Well, that's all I have, sir. I want to thank everybody for listening. My gosh, we're so appreciative. Hey, we should get into interviewing people more. People, I know you're out there with experiences. You need to hit us up on Facebook or YouTube and say, I want to be interviewed, and we will hit you up because we know you're out there. We know people experience this stuff. Don't be embarrassed. We can black your face out. I think we have that technology.
Oh yeah, we could do it to where, yeah, if you don't want to be on video, we could not have you on video. Like I can do stuff to you. I could actually take the audio and I could do stuff to your voice to where it doesn't even sound like you. We can give you anonymity in this for sure, but we would love to hear your experiences.
Yeah, so hit us up. We hope you enjoy this. Welcome to a new month. And yeah, thank you, Patrick. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And we'll see you next week.
Bye, everybody.